Mushtaq, for that very generous introduction. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-mursaleen. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Rabbi yassir wa a'in. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim tasliman kathira. Amma ba'd. Thank you very much for this generous invitation to allow me to come and visit your university and to address you. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be here and speak with you today. The title of my talk, Islam and Scholarship Tradition, Historical Trajectories and Future Challenges, was prompted by my generous hosts. Although I did not pick the topic, I saw no need to suggest another theme, because it was something that I very well could have picked myself. The topic my host proposed is something close to my heart, because it raises a question or a series of questions that anyone who has spent much of his or her lifetime in Islamic studies must answer. Namely, what gain do we hope to achieve from an engaged study of the Islamic tradition in light of the radically changed circumstances that we find ourselves in today because of modernity? To put it crudely, one might ask, shouldn't we just all study mathematics, the natural sciences, and engineering? Isn't that what we as Muslims are in most desperate need of? Aren't we wasting our time doing Islamic studies, in other words? The great Fazlur Rahman, the champion of an unapologetic Muslim modernism, wrestled with this question too. Even as he spent a lifetime in virtual intellectual combat with traditional forces within the religious establishment, he argued vehemently against those Muslim modernists who, in the name of modernity, believed that Islamic sciences were irrelevant and that religion, properly, should have a very marginal role to play in the newly independent, modernizing Muslim republics, such as Indonesia, for example. What it is that we can gain from our tradition as modern Muslims, therefore, remains a question that is deeply unsettled in modern Muslim societies. And it's also deeply divisive, in some cases more than others. We can broadly point to three approaches to the Muslim past, and the respective vision each approach adopts toward Muslims' futures. The first can be described as an approach inspired by the French concept of laïcité, a certain conception of secularism that sees human liberation and progress as requiring the ever-increasing marginalization of religion in social life and its replacement with science. The second is a mirror image of the first. It rejects modern civilization as anti-human and anti-religion, and is determined to resist even the most minor changes to historical doctrines or teachings, whether these be in the domain of ritual or law or piety. The third is a broadly reformist trend that in principle wishes to affirm against the traditional camp the legitimacy of modernity, and against the secularist trend the continued legitimacy of the Islamic tradition. Most Muslims, if one were to engage in a head count, would claim to be followers of this third tendency. The problem, however, is there is no agreed approach to reform that is recognized commonly and broadly as successfully affirming both modernity and Islam. As a result, this group of Muslims is, as a practical matter, more divided than either of the first two groups, namely the secularists and the traditionalists. The secularists are very united in what they want. They want ideally no religion, but the less religion, the better. The traditionalists are very united in what they want, mainly no modernity if possible, but less modernity better than all. It's sort of reformist Muslims that are divided along trying to determine what is the proper approach to modernity. In this lecture, I will map out these three different camps and lay out my own conception of modernity and what it means for Islam and Muslims, as we consider what we can adopt from our tradition, as we attempt to navigate the multiple challenges that modernity poses. One need not be a scholar to recognize the ubiquity of the claim that Muslims have no hope of advancing unless they embrace secularism, but that it is impossible or difficult for them to do so because the nature of their religion, i.e. Islam, does not distinguish between the secular and the religious. Therefore, according to this school of thought, Muslims must make a choice between remaining faithful to their religion or becoming modern. It is impossible to engage such arguments without considering what is meant by the term secular. The sociologist of religion, Jose Casanova, argues that the term secular and its related term secularization bears at least three meanings, only one of which he believes is a necessary constitutive part of modernity. The first meaning of secularization refers to the differentiation of various social spheres, with each social sphere increasingly being governed by its own internal logic. From this perspective, modern society becomes increasingly secularized as various social domains, such as the market, the university, the family, the religion, the political, all become autonomous and organize themselves according to their own internal logic. Such a view of the secular does not require the disappearance of religion, but it does imply that religion no longer governs, directly or indirectly, other domains of social life. It allows, however, for the possibility that religion, as a source of moral value, can interpenetrate these other domains, such as the market, politics, and the family. In other words, an actor in the market, a trader, for example, a politician in the political, or a family member, may very well, while respecting the internal differentiated logics of each of these institutions, bring his or her own subjective religious orientation into these institutions. Accordingly, there is nothing from a sociological perspective barring the existence of a league of religiously motivated businesses, for example, something that we see in various places that are undoubtedly modern, such as the United States, like some sort of federation of Christian businessmen or federation of Muslim businessmen, something to that effect. I've argued that from this perspective, i.e. this perspective of secularization as social differentiation, traditional Islamic law already reflects the process of secularization insofar as it engages in systematic differentiation among various domains of social life. Islamic law, for example, systematically distinguishes religious observance from non-religious observance through the stipulation that the former include the subjective intent to serve God, niyat al-taqarrub lil-khaliq. Even though Islamic law organizes marriage and the market contractually, it distinguishes the household from the market insofar as individuals who constitute households are regulated under a norm of generosity, mukarama or musamaha, while market participants act under a norm of arm's length dealing in which seeking one's personal advantage is the organizing principle, i.e. mukayasa or mushaha. At the same time, in all of these respective domains, the individual actor is free to adopt a religious point of view as he or she acts in that domain. Imam Ghazali's work, Ihya Ulumuddin, particularly the chapter on trade, Kitab al-Makasib, provides an excellent example of the social differentiation of spheres that marks secularization. While Ghazali adopts the framework of the law of exchange as the background to his discussion, he spends most of his discussion focusing on the psychological motivations of the pious businessman and the pious practices particular to the pious merchant, such as selling on credit to the poor without ever intending to collect the debts that the poor owe him. The second conception of secular is related to the distinction between the public and the private, with religion being relegated to the private domain. Secularization from this perspective is closely related to the idea of privatization of religion and its withdrawal from public life, and its attending exclusively to the private welfare of the soul. Although Casanova clearly believes that the internal logic of religion is such that it tends to become increasingly and almost exclusively concerned with matters related to the welfare of the individual soul, and indeed, he uses an example of Imam Ghazali and his counsel to the pious to stay aloof and away from the institutions of the ruler to exemplify the natural tendency of religion to focus on private salvation. However, Casanova rejects the notion that modernity requires religion to be concerned exclusively with the private concerns of salvation. He noted that in many countries, religion has played an important public role in securing a transition away from authoritarianism and toward democracy. While the expected course of religious life in any society might tend toward the privatization of religion, Casanova argues that it is by no means sociologically necessary for religion to be privatized in modernity. The third conception of secular and secularism is its use to refer to a system of thought or way of life that is positively contrasted with religious ways of knowing and living, such that the secular is posited to be the superior to religion. Secularization in this sense is understood as transcending religion, as a necessary step toward realizing a better future. This conception of the secular is based on a certain progressive interpretation of history, in which religion is understood to be a way of organizing human society at a particular stage of its civilizational evolution, but that to be a modern society means abandoning religion, both as the organizing principle of society and the default outlook of the median person, in favor of science and other materialistic modes of social organization and ways of life. As a practical matter, this conception of the secular and secularism entails the increasing social irrelevance of religion to modern society, as individuals and institutions, for lack of a better term, cease to care about religion at all. Religion is viewed as the equivalent of a relic from the past doomed to disappear. According to Casanova, this conception of secularization as the disappearance of religion is a particularly continental European phenomenon, and as a result of the particular structure that conflicts over religion took place on the European continent. Far from being a universal entailment of modernity, Casanova argues that secularization, in the sense of the disappearance of religion, is a particularly European phenomenon. Despite the different conceptions of secularism and the different kinds of secularization they suggest, secularism as the opposite of religion and as representing a future and superior stage of human civilization seems to be the dominant association of the term secular and secularism in contemporary Muslim thought. I believe this is largely a result of the genealogy of secularism in 19th century Muslim reformist thought. According to Casanova, continental Europe adopted the conception of secularism as the replacement of religion because of its conflicts with the church. In the face of increasingly well-organized social forces in the market and the state, the church, instead of ceding to secularization in the sense of social differentiation, stood in the way of these different domains' attempts to organize themselves autonomously. As a result, in order for principles of market rationality or political rationality to prevail, each of these domains had to claim independence from the church. In other words, for these different social domains to claim their institutional and moral autonomy, they had to claim that they had moved beyond the reach of the church by virtue of the progress they had achieved in their own domains. I believe a similar dynamic, albeit less extreme, took place in the Muslim world, particularly in the Ottoman Empire, in the 19th century. In the face of European imperialism, Muslim thinkers sought to reform Muslim society to enable it to resist Western imperialism. In doing so, however, large sectors of the ulama resisted these reforms on the grounds that the reforms were irreligious, even though none of these articulated reforms challenged Islamic theological dogma. The fierce resistance to reforms in the 19th century among certain sectors of the ulama, particularly in the domain of the economy, had the effect of making those sectors intent on reform become more extreme in their demands. Instead of arguing for reform of particular doctrines within Islamic law to conform them with the needs of a modern economy, they argued that society must transcend religion itself. This approach to Islam and modernity triumphed most prominently in the Ottoman Empire. In the wake of the defeat of the Ottomans in World War I, and the victory of the Turkish nationalists under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk over the Allied powers that sought to dismember Turkey, the Turks declared a secular republic and set out to remake Turkish society along scientific secular lines. The relative success of the Turkish nationalists, moreover, resulted in imitators throughout the Muslim world, with many educated Muslims coming to the conclusion that the progress of their societies would only be achieved by liberating their societies from the influence of religion and replacing religion with science. One of the ironies of secularism in the Muslim world is that staunchly secularist regimes that believe that progress lies in abandoning religion are perfectly happy to make temporary alliances with traditional religious forces that are opposed in principle to any kinds of reforms. Because secularists believe in the inevitable decline of religion, they are happy to align with religious forces that resist change, believing that this simply accelerates society's alienation from religion. If Casanova's account of religion and modernity is accurate, the path before us is clear. First, religion should not attempt to block the institutional differentiation and resulting autonomous development of different social domains if religion wishes to retain an important role in modern society. Second, as a positive matter, religion should cultivate in its adherents a particular ethic that directs them to incorporate their religious values into their work in the various social spheres that are becoming increasingly autonomous under the conditions of modernity. As I have suggested above, Islamic law in principle already does this, or did so in a fashion appropriate for pre-modern societies. It both tried to distinguish from the perspective of the law different social domains, and it also sought to cultivate in individual Muslims an ethic of responsibility to pursue these different domains with a view toward earning God's pleasure in the next life through cultivation of a niyyah to view their actions as being in service to God. Although that latter aspect was supererogatory, commendable. It wasn't constitutive of the secular activity itself. In other words, one could engage in commerce with an intention to serve God, but the intention to serve God does not constitute the domain of commerce. Commercial logic constitutes the domain of commerce. Right? The problem that has arisen is that in the context of modernity, Islamic law has not been able to adapt sufficiently rapidly to the radically changed social circumstances that face Muslim society. As a result, religion often appears either as a reactionary social force, fanatically registering its disapproval of social changes that are practically irresistible, or as irrelevant in managing the social transformations modernity has produced. Because so much of the controversy surrounding Islam and modernity is related to issues of law, I now turn to discuss Islamic law and its relationship to modernity. The conceptual architecture of Islamic law theorizes both a normal state of the world in which ordinary rules apply, and an abnormal state of the world in which exceptional rules apply. This is evident in the juristic division of rules into azima and rukhsa. The former is the rule that applies in ordinary circumstances, while the latter is the rule that applies in extraordinary circumstances. This division is most explicitly developed in ritual law, ibadat. The legality of dispensations in ritual law is ubiquitous in the sources of Islamic law. Thus, the Quran itself permits a dispensation to the obligation to fast if one is sick or on a journey. Likewise, numerous reports in the Sunnah establish that when someone is traveling, they are entitled to shorten their prescribed prayers, a teaching that is confirmed by universal Muslim consensus. The Quran also provides express dispensation to the rules of pilgrimage, providing that persons suffering from lice infestation or are precluded from completing their pilgrimage on the account of the actions of an enemy were permitted to exit the state of ihram even though they hadn't completed their pilgrimage. Likewise, the Quran expressly excused those who were unfit for military service from the obligation to participate in jihad with the Prophet ﷺ. Jurists may differ on the extent of these dispensations and whether they may be applied analogically, but there's no dispute as to their existence. While a similar division exists in transactional law, muamalat, calls to activate the greater use of extraordinary rules in this latter domain of Islamic law have generally been met with substantial skepticism, if not outright rejection. This reluctance might stem from the paucity of express texts recognizing dispensations in the context of transactional law. Even here, however, the texts of the Sharia include express rules that affirm the principle of extraordinary legislation in the context of muamalat. The Prophet ﷺ, for example, prohibited the sale of something not in the possession of the seller. But he permitted, nevertheless, forward sales, bay'u salam. Likewise, the Prophet prohibited hire contracts with an indefinite wage, so that if you hire somebody to do a service for you, you have to specify how much the worker will get. Despite this prohibition, he permitted the mudaraba contract, even though the investment agent's wage is uncertain at the time of the contract. It only becomes determinate when he comes back from the trading trip. The Prophet ﷺ also prohibited the sale of dried dates for fresh dates because you can't guarantee equality, and so that would be riba. But he nevertheless permitted the araya sale, which allowed the owner of date palms to sell his unharvested fresh dates while they are still on the tree for dried dates that were delivered immediately. In short, despite general prohibitions of riba and gharar, the Prophet ﷺ permitted some transactions that were well known to his community as dispensations, rukhas, exceptions to the general rule. Despite the general acknowledgement of dispensations from general rules in transactional law, however, jurists have been reluctant to extend these textual dispensations from their original contexts to new transactions, citing the interpretive principle that exceptions cannot form the basis for further analogies. لا يقاس على الرخص. Islamic jurisprudence also recognized concepts such as necessity, ad-darura, and convenience, raf al-haraj, that jurists applied in various cases, novel cases, to generate exceptions to otherwise generally applicable prohibitions. Numerous rules in Maliki law reflect this sensibility. For example, Malik radiallahu anhu permitted the mint to be paid its fee out of the raw gold that it struck into dinars, despite the facial violation of the rules of riba entailed in such an arrangement. This maybe is a little foreign to us, but back in the day when gold was the basis of currency, you might have gold at your house in the form of gold bars or jewelry or whatever, and you wanted to make them coins. So you would go to the mint of the government, give them your gold, the mint would melt it and then turn it into gold dinars, and they would take a fee, like say 1% of your gold. So Malik said this was okay, even though it was an unequal exchange of gold. Okay, that's the point. Maliki jurists also recognized as binding a hire contract to provide animal transportation to the Hijaz during the pilgrimage season, while they permitted the customer to defer payment until such time as the pilgrimage caravan actually set out to the Hijaz. Such a contract violated the ordinary rule that before a hire contract becomes binding, either the customer must pay in advance or the worker must immediately begin performance of the labor. Malik also permitted the sale of objects containing gold or silver, for example, a sword with gold in its handle, or a mushaf written in gold script, for gold or silver coins, provided that the percentage of the gold or silver in the sword or the mushaf was less than 1/3 of that item's value. Later Maliki jurists, too, sometimes offered exceptions to the general prohibitions on the basis of necessity or convenience in situations where they had been persuaded that a general economic need existed for that exception. One such example was a partnership for the production of cheese from the milk of sheep that were individually owned but were pastured together under the supervision of 1 or 2 shepherds. Such a partnership entailed violations of ordinarily applicable prohibitions against gharar and riba because the shepherd did not separate, nor could he separate, the milk each sheep produced. Instead, the milk of the entire flock was mixed together into sort of one barrel or one chamber. Maliki jurists in Andalusia also permitted partnerships in the production of silk, even though that arrangement violated the rule that hire contracts whose wage derived from the output of labor were invalid. So normally in Islamic law, you can't hire somebody to do a task and then say your wage is going to come from the product that results from your work. So if you own a piece of land, you can't hire somebody and say, plant rice on my land and you will get half of the rice that comes out of the land. That's an impermissible ijara in fiqh. In short, just as Islamic law recognized exceptional rules in the context of ritual law, jurists also recognize exceptional rules in transactional law, albeit these were fewer in number and more likely to be controversial, given the reality that jurists often introduced them in response to novel situations, and there was a reluctance to extend previously recognized exceptions to new situations. Now, crucial to the azima-rukhsa dichotomy was the expectation that the ordinary rule continued to apply. This is evidenced perhaps most clearly in the application of dispensations to Bedouins. Bedouins, precisely because they were constantly on the move, were not permitted to shorten their prayers or to exempt themselves from fasting during Ramadan. For the pre-modern jurists, dispensations were not only conceptually derivative of the ordinarily applicable rule, they were sociologically derivative as well. The assumption was that the need to rely on dispensations, whether in connection with ritual observance or transactions, was extraordinary, rare, and unintended. Right? You took advantage of a rukhsa because you found yourself in the circumstances where you had to. You didn't go out and seek a rukhsa. Matter of fact, they said, tatallub al-rukhas haram. You're not supposed to go out and try to put yourself in a situation where you need a rukhsa. Right? So you don't plan a vacation during Ramadan, for example. Indeed, the stability of the norm and the social reality supporting it was generally an unstated assumption of the jurists. Shatabi, for example, argued explicitly that the coherence of the Sharia, quote, is based on the constancy of the customs of legal subjects. كان التكليف مبنيا على استقرار عوائد المكلفين. Muslim jurists tolerated dispensations on the assumption that their use was infrequent enough that they did not undermine either the normative character of the generally applicable rule or its practical ability to regulate conduct. Capitalist modernity, particularly in the concept of transactional law, however, undermines this assumption. Capitalism does so for various structural reasons that fundamentally challenge the logical structure of historical Muslim fiqh. First, in conditions of capitalist production is geared primarily for the market and only secondarily for the subsistence of the household. Farmers, for example, don't grow crops with the intention to feed themselves and their family. Rather, they invest in cash crops, which they sell to the market for money, and then they hope to use profits that they realize to purchase what they need for the households. So farmers become merchants. They're no longer farmers in the way that the fuqaha understood them to be. As a result, credit transactions, instead of being exceptional, become the norm. Farmers become vulnerable to market forces in a manner inconceivable in an age when subsistence farming was the norm. If you were a subsistence farmer, a bumper crop was a great thing. You had lots of food for you and your family, and then you might have some extra to sell. But when you become a capitalist farmer, a bumper crop might be a terrible thing because it might produce an excess supply of the crop, leading to a collapse in the price, in which case you don't make any profit despite the fact that you grew a lot of food. More generally, modern capitalist production entails the substitution of machines for human labor, producing productivity gains of several orders of magnitude. One consequence of this increased efficiency is that technologies of industrial production cannot be universally adopted. If everyone adopted the same machinery to produce the same goods, the market would be oversupplied, no one would make a profit, and all producers would have to shut down. Capitalist production requires both economies of scale, so that costs of production decline as output rises, and restriction of output to ensure that production is profitable. This means that capitalist methods of production produce concentrated rather than diffuse nodes of production. This is the opposite of what happened in agricultural economies. In traditional farming communities, expansion of agriculture results in declining productivity as less productive land is brought into production. Producers, moreover, are constantly under pressure to innovate to produce more and different goods under capitalist conditions of production. And they must do so more quickly and more cheaply just to stay in business because there's constant innovation. This constant innovation in a modern capitalist economy means the economy is inherently unstable. Both products and the technology that are produced quickly become obsolete under the pressures of competition. Because of the tendency in capitalist production to substitute machines for human labor, there's a tendency or there's a necessity for displaced labor to find new outlets for their productive capacities. Right? So if you use a machine to plow the soil, and that replaces 10 farmers, then those 10 farmers need to find something else to do, right? And so this creates a reality in which workers have to engage in constant learning in order to adapt to the changing requirements of production. It is practically impossible, moreover, to opt out of capitalist competition. Populations generally appreciate the ability to purchase more goods and services at a lower price. But because one must trade for these goods, one is forced to sell one's own output on the international market to obtain funds to pay for imported industrial goods. That means that one must gear one's production to satisfy the demands of external markets, not one's own domestic market. So the whole theory of comparative advantage says, well, Indonesia, let's say, has an advantage in producing rice, so it's going to exploit its advantage in producing rice and then sell it in order to get, let's say, cars from Japan. But maybe it turns out that Japanese have a particular taste in rice. And so now Indonesians will have to change the kind of rice that they grow in order to meet the tastes of the Japanese purchaser. That's just the logic of international trade, right? You have to adapt all your techniques for the external consumer, external market. Now, unless a country chooses to isolate itself from the world economy, like North Korea, it will be practically impossible for it to avoid integration into the global capitalist economy. In order to become competitive in this global market, the population will have to acquire new skills, which implies a more or less radical transformation of the educational system, both in terms of breadth, meaning now almost everybody is going to have to become educated in order to acquire the skills necessary to produce goods and services that are in demand on the world market, and in substance, that you're going to teach new kinds of knowledge that prepares them, or at least hopefully prepares them, to be efficient producers in the modern economy. It's no longer good enough to know how to do what you did well for yourself, because now you are trying to produce things for the entire world. And so you have to acquire the skills necessary to do that effectively. Second, capitalist modernity radically transforms the family, and this is very, very important, even though nobody sets about to transform the family as far as I know. Improving access to public health, prenatal care, improved sanitation, and universal vaccinations against infectious diseases radically reduce both maternal mortality rates and infant and childhood mortality. So in pre-modernity, something like 3 in 10 women would die in childbirth. Imam Malik considered the last 3 months of pregnancy to be a deathbed illness, to be the equivalent of a soldier in a battle. Right? In Egypt, up until 1965, 35% of children died by the age of 5. If you can imagine that. That's only a generation ago. Right? And I'm sure statistics in Indonesia would have been fairly similar. Right? With modernity and the spread of public health, these death rates, alhamdulillah, collapse. Right? They collapse. They become close to zero. Right? So this results in a population boom. And so women initially will have substantially more children, surviving children than their mothers, right? And this results in a population boom that feeds into the radical economic transformation of society. Because rural economies lack opportunities for a booming population, a wave of rural immigration to the city is set off. Cities rapidly increase in size, and governments must adopt plans to absorb these internal migrants, build infrastructure for them, and provide them with housing and other basic services. The role of the state is therefore necessarily transformed. The state now must act proactively. It must plan how to manage these radical social changes and how to transform the environment in which the people live to accommodate them to a radically changed future. So we can know in the future that we are going to have 25 million more people in Indonesia. So this requires planning. Governments in the pre-modern world didn't have to plan for the future because society sort of lived in what was known as a Malthusian equilibrium. Birth rates, however, quickly come down, and women seek new opportunities outside the home where they can earn income based on the skills they acquire in the new educational system. They no longer need to spend the entirety of their lives to produce 2 surviving children, because children survive, and women don't die in childbirth anymore. So they don't need to spend 20 years having kids anymore, on average, right? They can do so in 4 or 5 years. So this creates an extra 15 or 20 years, at least, of potential productivity, and they have skills, so of course they want to use them in the market, right? So this radically transforms economic relations within the household relative to the pre-modern household. These are just some of the radical transformations that take place if the transition to capitalist modernity goes well. If it goes poorly, society will experience a population boom without the necessary increase in economic growth, resulting in mass unemployment, social unrest, a weak state with insufficient resources to make necessary investments in social infrastructure, and increased poverty as society fails to make a transition into producing more valuable goods for the world market and gets stuck exporting primary goods on relatively worse terms every year. Moreover, past success is no guarantee for continued success. Countries can make major policy errors from which it might take years for them to recover, if they ever recover at all. It is for good reason, therefore, that Marx described the era of capitalism as one in which, quote, all that is solid melts into air. It's fair to say that pre-modern Muslim jurists, even if they thought in terms of normal law and exceptional law, never imagined a situation in which the exception is continually enforced. Accordingly, the historical fiqh, with its focus on the rights of private persons, does not seem adequate to meet these kinds of challenges. For Islamic law to meet the challenges of capitalist modernity, I believe that much more attention needs to be focused on the concept of collective obligations in fiqh, what the jurists call furud kifaya. These need to become the center of legal deliberation, not the traditional individual rights that the fiqh has placed historically at the center of its concerns. If this is true, then the most important aspect of Islamic law in the modern world is legislation, not fatwa. So legislation has to replace fatwa as the primary means to regulate modern Muslim society. In the face of the unprecedented challenges of modernity, the question that advocates of a middle way, one that neither sees religion as something to be transcended or as something that requires unquestioning acceptance of all of its historical teachings, must answer is how to navigate the Islamic tradition to create this middle way. Rashid Rida, writing in the first quarter of the 20th century, recognized the mismatch between traditional Islam making through fatwa and the lawmaking needs of the Muslim community in modernity that required legislation. Rida's concern was that the structure of the historical fiqh, based on the bilateral relationship between the petitioner and the legal expert, al-mustafti and al-mufti, was institutionally inappropriate for passing binding general law that could organize the common interests of the Muslim community. Rida realized that the proper form of legality and modernity was the statute adopted by deliberative bodies rather than the legal opinion derived from interpretation of revelation. Now, a lot of people confuse the activities of a legislature with the activities of a mufti. This misconceives the aim of modern legislation. The focus of the mufti is on the dalil shar'i, a particular text of revelation, whether that be Quran or Sunnah or Ijma'. Modern legislatures, however, are focused on prospective questions of the public interest, al-maslaha al-amma. They are managing the perpetual crisis that capitalist competition and capitalist transformation produce. Their judgment is always built on the empirical evidence of the social sciences. There's always, therefore, a tension between the modern legislature's attempts to manage the crisis and historical rights. So, a good example of this is universal public education. If you read fiqh, the fiqh tells you that the father is the guardian of the minor children. And as the guardian of the minor children, the father has the right to supervise their education, determine what kind of education they will get, if any, or whether they should go to work, etc., etc. Right? Modern states, and I assume Indonesia is one of them, has compulsory education law. Should we view that as contradicting fiqh? I would say no, because what instead is happening is that the legislature, in its capacity as waliyul amr, right, determinant of public welfare, has decided that the best interest of the child lies in getting a general education, not only for the child's own good, but also for the common good. And in his capacity, or in the state's capacity as the guardian or the protector of everybody's interests, it can repeal or it can preempt the discretion of the individual parent to that extent, right? So it's a substitution of the determination of the maslaha by the state for the determination of the maslaha by the parent, right? Both of them are under an obligation to act for the maslaha of the child, right? The question is, institutionally, who gets the final word? So when the state gets the final word, that's not a contradiction of the Sharia. It's just a consequence of the duty to obey the ruler when the ruler issues a lawful command. Okay. Now, this raises the question of when is the state's actions legitimate? So this is a very important question to ask, and I say the fiqh has a theory about when the commands of the state are lawful and legitimate. And it's based on a theory of what makes the state legitimate. And so according to the fuqaha, the state is the representative, the na'ib, or the wakil of the Muslim community. And so for its acts to be legitimate, it must embody the virtues of a loyal and effective agent. What is a loyal and effective agent? Well, it's an agent that acts in the exclusive interest of its principal. In this case, it's the body of citizens who appointed it to act on their behalf. For example, the Indonesian people, right? And an agent also needs to be competent. An agent has to do his or her job at a certain level of care, what we call, competently. So, for example, in the fiqh, if I hire somebody to sell some of my commercial goods, and he goes and sells them, I can't object to his sale unless he sold them on terms that were completely non-commercial. So if the fair market value of the cloth, let's say, was $100 per unit, but he sold them for $2 per unit, then that would be gross negligence, and I could sue him. But if he sold them for $98, then that's kind of within the domain of market bargaining, right? Okay, so the agent has to be competent in doing the tasks assigned to him. Right? So, in general, we have criteria. Fiqh gives us a criteria for legitimacy of the acts of the state. They have to be loyal. They have to represent us sincerely, and they have to do so relatively competently. So if modern lawmaking is primarily legislative, and legislative acts are primarily based on empirical evidence of the public good, not the dalil shar'i, and also based on the expertise of the rulemaker, i.e. competence, one might reasonably ask whether Islam as a religion has anything meaningful to contribute to this process. Right? Now, while revelation may not provide us direct or clear answers regarding how we should define the public good or how to pursue it, I believe that Islam plays a fundamental role in enabling us to pursue the common good. The concept of the public good is critical for the legitimacy of any kind of public lawmaking in a Muslim government. But the indeterminacy of what constitutes the public good threatens to disable us from pursuing it effectively. How are we to determine what the public interest is? And how can we determine the most effective means to pursue it? Can we be confident that our institutions will lead to outcomes consistent with the common good? We know from the Quran that in many cases, deliberative bodies, what the Quran refers to as al-mala', can act in ways that are manifestly contrary to the public good. One such example is the story of Moses, where he is warned that, quote, the council is meeting to deliberate to plot your death, so flee. إِنَّ الْمَلْأَ يَأْتَمِرُونَ بِكَ لِيَقْتُلُوكَ فَخْرُجْ. Right? It is the rare case, such as that of Bilqis, where the deliberative council acts responsibly. The failure of deliberative bodies to act responsibly ought not surprise us. Insofar as they are made up of individuals, they can only be as good as their members. If the members are corrupt, then we can expect the outcomes of deliberation to be corrupt. Now, in my view, Islam has a direct role to play in solving this problem. By promoting the virtues necessary for responsible self-government, Islam teaches us how to pursue the common good responsibly. By internalizing important Islamic virtues, such as honesty, respect for evidence, acting for the benefit of others, among other virtues, Islam teaches Muslims the virtues required of agents entrusted with deliberating sincerely in furtherance of the public good, rather than using their power to pursue their own private interests. The key Islamic virtue in this respect is what the jurists called adala, the disposition to do one's duty reliably when called upon. Now, adala is not isma. This is important. A person can be adl and still commit mistakes. Right? It's just that when somebody has adala, they generally do the right thing. Not always, but generally. Adala entails respecting both the rights of others and demanding that others respect one's own rights. It also entails a willingness to cooperate with others in protecting their rights. It is in the cultivation of what's known as civic virtue among political theorists that I believe Islam has the most direct role to play in solving the problems attendant to democracy and thus contributing to governing complex modern societies. In this context, I wish to highlight one particular virtue that the Quran emphasizes, and one might say is foundational to all other civic virtues: epistemic responsibility. By epistemic responsibility, what I mean is that we take responsibility for what we believe and for what we argue to other people. We recognize that other people have the right to demand evidence for our views. Democracy paradoxically sets up the people both as judge and lawmaker, powers that we recognize in ordinary circumstances to violate the most basic standards of procedural fairness. Right? So if I had a dispute with Shifa about who owns a piece of property, everybody would say it would be unfair if I got to make the rule and then apply the rule. Right? But in democracy, that's what we do. We make our rules and then apply them. So it's a paradox of fairness. So in order for it to work, the citizens have to be able to learn simultaneously to act for the public good as well as thinking for their own interests. It's a paradox, right? Psychologically speaking. So for people to make just laws for themselves, they must learn the capacity to separate their judgment from their particular interests, to take on the broader view of the community and transcend their own limited view of what is good for themselves. Human beings, however, are clever creatures, and once they learn the language of the public good, they are fully capable of manipulating that language. Indeed, that is precisely the Qur'an's accusation against the hypocrites, who falsely claim the role of peacemaker while they actually pursue mischief. وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ لَا تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُصْلِحُونَ أَلَا إِنَّهُمْ هُمُ الْمُفْسِدُونَ وَلَكِنْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. Right? So people can falsely claim to be pursuing the public good when they're actually just trying to line their own pockets. So we have to learn critical thinking. Right? So the only possibility for just governance is when citizens, because they are just, pursue justice in their own political commitments and develop the sufficient critical skills to allow them to distinguish between genuine arguments for the public good and counterfeit ones. This is why epistemic responsibility, meaning that we hold ourselves accountable for what we say and what we believe, is crucial for the success of democracy. It is not surprising that epistemic responsibility is foundational to our creed as Muslims. The Quran speaks directly to the foundational virtue of epistemic responsibility in verse 36 of Surah Al-Isra, which broadly emphasizes epistemic responsibility as foundational to Quranic wisdom. It states, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Without epistemic responsibility, it is simply impossible to conceive of democracy as a functioning system of just government. Accordingly, it is not too much of an exaggeration to describe it as the foundational civic virtue. A person who internalizes the Qur'an's conception of epistemic responsibility will be less likely to manipulate evidence for his own self-serving ends rather than to engage in good faith deliberation about the public good. Islam, by instructing the public broadly and inculcating them with civic virtues broadly, and the civic virtue of epistemic responsibility particularly, can play a crucial role in establishing a secure basis for just governance, just self-governance. And here I would add, I think this is a particularly important virtue that we can learn from the Islamic sciences. Usul al-fiqh, kalam, ilm al-hadith, all of them are concerned with establishing the grounds on which we are justified in making a claim. And it's not simply dogmatic. It's not either truth or falsehood. One of the great features, I think, of Islamic epistemology is that it guides us to recognizing that there is a spectrum of knowledge going from jahl to yaqeen. So we can have jahl, we can have shak, we can have dhan, we can have dhan rajih, we can have dhan mutakhim lil yaqeen, we can have yaqeen. So it teaches us how to evaluate claims critically and non-dogmatically. And I think these are one of the most important skills required for a democratic citizenry, and one of the most important things that Islamic education provides us. While Islam cannot provide ready-made, off-the-shelf, concrete solutions for the particular problems wrought by modernity, it can play a crucial role in preparing us to govern ourselves responsibly in the face of the crisis that modernity produces. Part of the Islamic responsibility for governing ourselves in the modern world, in fact, a large part of it, or most of it, consists in learning about the modern world. The systematic pursuit of learning has long been associated with Islam as a civilization. And while this has traditionally been associated with the religious sciences, pursuit of this knowledge pursuit of secular sciences is equally an obligation in our religion. When we encourage foundational Islamic virtues, including the duty to pursue all forms of useful knowledge, secular and religious, and we demand of ourselves that we master modern sciences, we are making important, indeed crucial, contributions to our capacity to govern ourselves effectively in the modern world as Muslims. It is true that we cannot open our inherited books, and find ready-made solutions to numerous practical problems. But we can, if we study these books with an open mind, use them to shape our priorities, sharpen our intellects and critical thinking skills, and using those skills, master modern knowledge and direct it toward achieving our common, and we can use that to direct it toward achieving our common good. Traditional Islamic scholarship, therefore, is profoundly more valuable than a source of magical solutions. It can orient us toward thinking critically in the modern world and help us formulate our priorities properly so that we do not misuse the responsibility of self-government given to us. Thank you for your attention.